Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason Kapalka. I'm the thanks. I'm the co-founder and chief creative officer of PopCap Games, and I've been invited here to talk about the postmortem of Bejeweled. So I have to admit that I'm a little bit nervous about this because I don't do a lot of presentations to begin with, but this one in particular was a little overwhelming when I was asked about participating in it. The first thing when I mentioned it to someone, a conversation went something like this. I'm talking on the classic game postmortems, and they said, "Oh yeah, what game?" I said, "What game do you think?" I mean, Bejeweled. And they're like, "Oh yeah, okay, I guess maybe that is a classic game in some way." But then I looked at the list of other games, and it was stuff like Maniac Mansion and Out of This World and Doom. And then Pac-Man of all things, and that's the first thing that comes up when you Google Pac-Man. So, you don't get that for Bejeweled. Well, actually, maybe you might, but so it's a little bit overwhelming. And then of course Will Wright. So the only thing that made me feel a little bit better is then they mentioned that this was my first reaction. Of course, was they were not worthy, but it felt like Justin Bieber getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. But then someone pointed out that Marble Madness was also on the list, and no offense to Mark Kearney or anything, but I hate Marble Madness. In my arcade back at home, someone had poured a Coke onto the Marble Madness machine, and so the trackball was always just a little bit sticky, and so you just would fly off the edge all the time whenever you played it. So I felt okay. I felt like we could be in the company of Marble Madness because pretty soon they'd be letting in Gorf and stuff like that. So. Anyway, so I decided that the best thing I could do is present the history of Bejeweled, but tell people some things that maybe they don't actually know. And I have a feeling that there's actually going to be stuff in this that even people in our company don't know. And I can 100% guarantee there's stuff in this that our PR guys don't want people to know. So I can guarantee we'll include at least one never-before secret and also one complete lie. But I'm not going to tell you which is which. So we celebrated Bejeweled's 10th anniversary last year, which was kind of a surprise. It took us a while before we even realized it and said, "Oh yeah, it's 10 years old. Huh? How about that?" It went by so fast. The strange thing when you thought about that is it's a once a short period of time and a very long one. And I keep hearing people who come up and say, "Oh yeah, I played Bejeweled in high school." And if you're Miley Cyrus, I can believe that. But you have people like this coming up and saying that they played Bejeweled in high school. And so, this can't be possible. And you tell them, no, I don't think you did. And they're like, "Yeah, I did." And I was like, no, you didn't. But then I realized that for myself, certain games have kind of taken on a bit of an iconic status beyond their actual reality. For example, I'm quite sure I played World of Warcraft in high school. The Wikipedia says that couldn't have happened, but it feels like that. So in a sense, some games have, become iconic enough that they become bigger than they really are. And for better or worse, I think Bejeweled has done that. In 2001, when I told people I made Bejeweled, usually they say, "So what? What is that? I don't know." In 2011, usually the response is different. It's sort of as if it's almost as if, in some cases, it's like, "Oh yeah, what else did you invent? The paperclip?" That's been around forever. I don't know if Bejeweled is art, but it has sort of achieved this sort of weird ubiquity in pop culture, which, I can take some credit for it, but obviously part of it is weird forces that in the general zeitgeist that we don't have that much control over. I'm not going to go over too much of the sort of stats on Bejeweled because I'm assuming that most people who showed up here have some idea of what the game is. But these are a couple of ones we have about the total units sold, 50 million supposedly, 500 million players, and 7 billion hours of play, which I'm told is 800,000 years. So that's quite a lot. But it all started in a much more humble way, which was with me working at the Total Entertainment Network here in San Francisco back in 1995. And I started there as a writer/editor. I became later on a game producer. and our job was to look for online games to bring to people that they could play on their 24-bit K modem things. So these are a couple of shots of me from earlier days. Okay, I'll go over. I'm just going to skip past that. This is one of the other co-founders, John Vici, who we met. I'd initially met him and the other co-founder of PopCap around 1997 when they'd invented a online game called Ark. And it was my job to wine and dine them and then to produce their game and to get it up onto 10. It was a bit of a surprise because at that time they were about 18. And so all my usual ploys, which were to take people to bars, were not feasible. There's another shot of John back in 2000. And here's John and Brian. We didn't have too many other shots of Brian that I was comfortable to show, but that's a pretty good one. And this was their game Attack Retrieve Ark, which was, it was kind of like Counter-Strike in 1997, but with little saucers instead of terrorists. It was a pretty fun kind of, team-based shooter at a time when that was not really being done very much. I thought they were really clever. They'd had a lot of really good ideas about games, so we kept in touch over the next couple of years. While I was working at 10, they went on to go to work at OneNet for Sierra. And in around 2000, we all decided that we were sick of our jobs, we could do it better, and so we quit and started a company out of our apartments. This is mine. John's was a lot messier. And so, we quit our jobs and started a brand new company, and that company was called Sexy Action Cool. There's a long story about where that name came from, but basically it comes down to the fact that there was a movie poster for Antonio Banderas' film Desperado back in a basement suite I lived in, and the tagline at the top said Sexy Action Cool, and that became a weird inside joke. And the other big aspect was that the URL was free, obviously. So the other thing that most people don't know about PopCap's original years was that our first game was not Bejeweled, but Foxy Poker, which you can see there. This was our ill-fated foray into pornography, where the theory was we would make a strip poker game and then sell that engine to porn companies and use that money to fund our awesome game ideas. So we did actually make it and release it. I think I actually have it here, so just one second. It's safe for work, don't worry. There we go. So it was basically video poker with a cartoon character who would strip after you got enough money. So it was not bad as video poker went. We couldn't actually bring ourselves to do any pornography though. So the character there never actually becomes fully nude. She ends up in a state sort of like an Austin Power movie where there's always a bunch of objects sort of obscuring anything that might be naughty. So this was good in terms of not getting us in trouble with the authorities, but it disappointed a lot of the players of the game, who would spend quite a while. You'd have to spend multiple hours, and then at the end, the payoff was not what they really were hoping for. So we did this initially, and it had a little bit of popularity on on the websites we were hosting it on, but eventually, what we found was that, there you can see at a later stage. What we actually learned was that if you're going to be sleazy, you really want to do it all the way. And so if you're going to do a strip poker game, you should probably have some nudity in it. And the people we were dealing with in that industry also didn't really feel like the kinds of people we wanted to spend the rest of our lives doing business with. So we decided that maybe we should get into a different industry, something like family games. However, this was the next lesson we learned, is that when you incorporated a company called Sexy Action Cool, you have a few things that will haunt you for a while. So for several years after this, we were using the PopCap name and logo and our website, but according to our banks and so forth, we were still Sexy Action Cool. doing business as PopCap Games, but still, that would be what people's checks said for at least several years. And as a Canadian, I also had a work visa that said I worked for an internet company called Sexy Action Cool. So I've had some troubles with the U.S. border guards over the years, and they definitely, I got a few extra questions, I think, at the border due to that. So that's a lesson to be learned for people is think about that name. So eventually we switched to PopCap, and here's a couple early logos. Wow. I did all these, by the way, if you're curious. I'm available for logo design. And this was, I think, my first business card, which still has my original address here in San Francisco. Pretty shortly after that, I moved up to Vancouver, and we started the office in Seattle and so on. Anyway, so after we decided to make that change in direction, we did our first game, and the game idea was to do something that was a simple web-based game in Java. Mostly our idea was that we would sell it back to some of the companies we'd worked for before, like Pogo.com or OneNet, because we thought we could do it quicker and more efficiently than those organizations were doing it. So we made our first game, and it was called Diamond Mine. This was the original name for Bejeweled, as some people might know. But before I get into the details of how that was made, I'm going to answer the question of who we ripped off Bejeweled from. There's been a lot of speculation on this topic, and I've followed with great interest over the years. Most recently, there were some people who thought that we ripped it off from an old Russian game called Shiriki, which was like 1973 on some sort of like Russian mainframe computer, I guess. I've never heard of it before now, but it's possible. Tetris was a common one people brought up, although, of course, the game is nothing like Tetris whatsoever. But then there's a game called Tetris Attack, which apparently does involve swapping of pieces only on a side-to-side basis. Interesting. Again, not the game that we were familiar with at all. And most recently, at dinner 2 nights ago, when we mentioned that we did Bejeweled, the waitress's first response was, "Oh yeah, that was a ripoff of Columns, right?" And I hadn't thought of that, but it kind of is. Although Columns was, you just had a block of 3 pieces that fell down a la Tetris, and you could sort of shift the position of the gems in there. So I'm sure it had some influence on the whole genre, but it was not the game that we were conscious of as an influence. And of course, some academic writers have gone on to create entire family trees of all the match 3 games that influenced Bejeweled and then were influenced from there, which I found really fascinating because I hadn't heard of any of them. I'm quite curious to check out Panel de Pawn at some point, but it wasn't a conscious influence. I can tell you who we actually ripped off Bejeweled from. And this was because John Vici one day came to us and said, "Well, what should we do?" And he said, "I found a cool game." And he showed it to us. And it was called Colors Game. And it was a terrible game. It was an awful game. And we told John, "This is stupid. What are you talking about?" And he said, "No, you got to play it. It's kind of cool." And so we played it for a little bit. And we thought, well, no, it's not cool. He said, "But the mechanic is cool." And we said, well, I don't know. The problem with Colors Game is that it's a phantom game. We've not been able to relocate it at any time. Even using things like the Internet Archives and Wayback Machine, no one has actually ever found it. So I figure this is as good a time as any. If anybody here knows who made Colors Game, we'd be quite curious to hear. Because it literally has no proof. I could only I sort of designed this as a reenactment of what it looks like. This is actually probably better than Colors Game looked. Colors Game it wasn't even in Java. I think it was in JavaScript. So I think you had to refresh the page after every move. So it didn't actually animate or have sound or anything like that. I don't even know if it had a score or an end condition. But John thought the matching condition was kind of cool. And so we thought, well, okay. And Brian, who was our programmer and tech lead, he went off and wrote a much better engine in Java that had animation and stuff like that. So yeah, we did add a few things to Colors Game. So we feel that we've evolved the gameplay a little bit. The big thing that I was focused on initially was the playing pieces, because Colors Game was a bunch of featureless squares of color. It was hard to play, even without animation and so on, because the squares were difficult to tell apart. God knows if you're colorblind, it would have been much worse. So I thought it would be a good idea to have different shapes, because you're looking at basically a pattern recognition thing. It would be easier, to look at different shapes. But I was also a big believer in themes, and so I wanted to make sure that it was something that had a clear visual theme that made sense. And so I started thinking about, what comes in groups of 7, that has radically different colors and shapes, but, still hangs together as one family? And the obvious answer was, of course, fruits. That was wrong, because the problem is most fruits, there's not actually, finding 7 different colors of fruit is actually kind of hard, and finding 7 different shapes of fruit is also hard. Fruits tend to be kind of roundish for the most part. So instead of a whole bunch of squares, you had a whole bunch of circles. So then my next thought was gems, which seems like a better idea, but just finding a bunch of actual gemstones on the internet yielded a bunch of things of not very interesting color and shape, so also wasn't very good. So what I ended up finding was that the best results came from just drawing circles, squares, triangles, and so forth, simple geometric shapes. But those were really boring. So I decided, what if I made those squares and triangles look a little bit like gems by drawing some facets on them? And indeed, that was kind of what I did. So these were this was the first pass of gems for what became Bejeweled. As you can see, there's a few kind of ones that hit the cutting room floor towards the bottom there. But a lot of them are still the classic shapes that we use in all the games since then. And so this is the actual first iteration of Diamond Mine. And I think I can actually play that too. A second. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see, this is it going to work? Yep. So a lot of the rules were pretty much the same as they are now. You swap 3 things and they disappear. The big thing that was added to later iterations were the power gems. In this case, if you make rows of 4 or 5 gems in a row, nothing very interesting happens. So, but obviously match 3 was a good deal, and swapping and gems falling, all that stuff turned out to be kind of a pretty workable idea. Here we go. Yeah. Now, the key thing that in retrospect that we came up with for Bejeweled that we didn't know at the time was not just the timer bar. The first thing we did was we put a timer bar into the game because we felt the original game, which was super crude, didn't have a timer and therefore wasn't a real game and so forth. So we put in a timer because we thought that's how you make it into a real arcade game. And that did work. But at the last minute, we decided, all right, let's leave level 1 as a tutorial without a timer so that people can get the hang of it, before they play the real game. As it turned out, most people didn't really understand that there was another level besides level 1 or that it was meaningful. And so they played that tutorial pretty much for the entire time they played the game, and that became the classic version of Bejeweled, was this untimed mode. So that was a bit of a mistake, but turned out to be a fortuitous one. Because I think, again, with the benefit of hindsight, Bejeweled in its classic untimed form is much more like Solitaire than is like Tetris. It's a game that you do have to pay attention and use your brain a little bit, but at the same time, it ends at a fairly random point. You can't really control, to any extent, when you're going to run out of moves any more than you can control the outcome of a typical Solitaire game once you follow very simple rules. So, and as a result, it's not that surprising that Bejeweled and Solitaire appeal to a lot of the same kinds of people, what we've come to call casual gamers, and which back in the day we called my mom. So, since this is a postmortem, I figured I'd better do the classic scenario in which we look over what went right and what went wrong in the process. And I've got enough time to go over that. So, yeah, this was the first thing that went right, is we ignored all the expert advice that we got. I'm not sure if this is going to be what everyone would want to do, but it sort of worked for us in this case. We talked to some people that I won't name, and they said, this isn't even really a game. Again, what I just described about the Solitaire thing, they did not see as a benefit. They saw that as a weakness. The fact that the game, ended because of luck rather than skill seemed to make it irrelevant. And of course, in retrospect now, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I can say, games of luck are not really bad. I mean, in fact, for the better part of human history, people have played games of luck quite a bit and continue to do so now. The only area where games of chance are not commonly accepted is, in fact, basically, this conference center. computer games have been designed as games of skill, and I think a lot of that comes from the roots in the arcade, where that's kind of how it was structured. You put in another quarter, you had to you'd had to play a bit more, you got a little bit better, so your time would last a little bit longer. So they have that DNA of being skill games, and I think that still continues to flavor what people think computer games should be like these days. So games of chance are considered something different. They're something that maybe you find in a slot machine in Las Vegas, but not something that you'd imagine in an actual video game. So that was the first thing. But at the time, of course, we didn't think about it that way. We just sort of said, my mom liked it, so that's okay. The second thing that I think we did right was we were completely oblivious to any sort of reality in the market. We started the company in, I think, late 2000, and some of you may recall that there were other things happening in the internet space around that time. There's a few more things here. Now, again, luckily for us, we didn't really understand any of that. I was aware of the fact that most of my friends didn't have jobs anymore, and were going, back to the Midwest. But we didn't really think that maybe this was not the best time to start a new .com business. So, again, another piece of what actually went right for us, because if we'd been paying attention to this, we probably would have gone into some other kind of business, certainly not an internet-based company. The next thing that went right also doesn't necessarily seem like the most obvious one, which is that we were quite unsuccessful with trying to sell the game in the way we thought we would. Our initial plan for Bejeweled was to, again, take it and sell it to the companies we'd worked for and talked with and get a flat payment. But those companies, they won't name, said no. And instead, one company, Microsoft, did agree to lease the game. They said, we can't afford $30,000 for this Diamond Mine game, but we could lease it for $1,500 a month. And we said, well, okay. And we did our calculations, and we thought, there's three of us, there's $500 a month. If we make another 20 games, we'll be doing great. So, yeah, and then, of course, in retrospect, if we'd sold the game for $30,000, things would be a little bit different now. So I suppose you can take that as, in the long run, you say, own your own IP, all that sort of thing. We didn't think of it that way at the time, but it turned out pretty well. But I guess the last thing that I'd say that went right was a little bit more relevant to things you can do now, which is we did make a game that we liked. There's a lot of games that are floating around in this space that were kind of advert games and so on. They were kind of just knocked out by people quickly with the idea of, we'll put this thing out, we'll make some money, we'll do what we really want to do. And we'd already done that, of course, with Foxy Poker. So we made a decision that, we're not going to do that. So if we're going to make a game, we're going to make a game that we take seriously, that we're going to make that, we ourselves like to play. And so and that's something that we've carried on since that day at PopCap, is that even if we're making games that are supposed to appeal to everybody, to the soccer moms and board secretaries and whatever else, we don't want to make a game that we ourselves don't like. So we're always the first and most important audience for any of our games. So yeah, and that as I said, we did use my mom to actually test out the games, but in the long run, we are actually making the games for ourselves, not for her. I still owe that? Okay. What's that thing doing up there? Anyway. So yeah, eventually that kind of led to our core game design belief, which is that if you're a skilled craftsman, you can indeed make games that you don't enjoy and probably be successful doing it. But you'll never make a really great game because you just won't have that sort of instinctive feeling for what you're doing, and you will kind of suck. Now, as for what went wrong with Bejeweled, well, we do have a few things there. The first one is that I had decided to name all the games I worked on after Canadian classic rock bands. So that led to some unusual names, and in this case, Diamond Mine was actually named after the song by the Canadian rock band Blue Rodeo, which is a pretty good song, by the way. Later on, I would name our next game, Big Money, after a song from the band Rush. So that was Rush at the time. So yeah, they're still a quite good band, but that turned out to be not the best name. And so some of you may not have heard of Diamond Mine before and are wondering when the game actually turned into Bejeweled. And the answer to that is Microsoft and Bedazzled. So when we licensed the game to Microsoft, they didn't like the name. They had some concerns about it. Their primary one was that they wanted to have a unique name for the game on their website that wasn't used elsewhere. And so they suggested a bunch of alternate names for the game that they wanted. And we hated all of them, but I especially hated Bejeweled because it was exactly at the same time as the Brendan Fraser movie Bedazzled was coming out. And I was sure it was like a really lame topical reference that was going to be totally dated and forgotten about in about 2 months after the fact. So that was true, but of course it was the other way around as far as which became sort of a dated pop culture reference. So yes, hate. I really hated the name Bejeweled. I hated it even more after we had an interview with Old Man Murray, which some people may remember as kind of the precursor to Penny Arcade. It was sort of a very bitter humor site back in the day, and I think the main writers have gone on to do a few little games like Portal or something like that. But yeah, they didn't interview with us and ask us about Bejeweled, except they continually referred to it as Bejewed and kept asking us what we had against the Jews. And of course, immediately after they did that, I couldn't help but think of that every single time I saw the word Bejeweled. So it took a few years before I was able to realize that, in fact, Bejeweled was a much better name than Diamond Mine. Just like Toby Hooper, took years before he admitted that Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a better name for his movie than his original title, which was Head Cheese. So, yes. So eventually we did decide Bejeweled is just a better name, and we switched Diamond Mine to Bejeweled on all the different sites. However, we had a price to pay for that. The price was that Microsoft had to agree to let us do that, and we ended up giving them the rights to put any sponsored version of Bejeweled up on their site basically forever. So the next time you see a really horrible-looking Bejeweled advert game, that's why. So I think we hit the nadir with Tyson Chicken Bejeweled, which had a lot of chicken pieces replacing the gems. There's a couple other ones. I think there was a vodka Bejeweled at one point. I think we nixed, which one? We had a Purina dog food Bejeweled at one point too. There was a pork board one as well, which I actually kind of liked because I wanted them to actually rename the game Be Porked, but they didn't do that. So, what else went wrong? The single screen UI, which now looks pretty bad. That was as a holdover from the days at Pogo, where you kind of had to fit all the UI onto one screen because the download size was so ridiculously small that you didn't want to add another 30K worth of graphics by having a title screen or a separate options screen or anything. So you kind of crammed all your UI onto the side of your game. And that it made sense at one time, but in retrospect, it ended up making for a pretty ugly user interface, and one that was kind of confusing to people in terms of which skill level they were supposed to pick or any of that sort of thing. So yes, by the time we got to Bejeweled 2, we had realized that a little more minimal UI was better, and so we'd kind of gotten rid of a lot of the clutter. That leads to the other problem we had, which is multiple game difficulties. That turned out to be a bit of an advantage in that most people didn't really understand the other game difficulties and stuck with that untimed version. But we didn't really understand that at the time, and so most of the games we did after that for a while, we kind of put a lot of different modes and a lot of different difficulty levels in there. And so here's a screen from Big Money. And I'm kind of not sure what I was thinking when we did this, because I have no idea what game I'm supposed to play here. This is generally my big beef with difficulty levels, is that if you come into a game that you've never played before, how do you know what level you want to play it at? Is it easy? Is it hard? Even games that are familiar genres like shooters often have radically different, difficulty levels, and it's a super high pressure thing to make a decision at. At the beginning of the game, you may not be able to change the difficulty later on. It's like, I don't know. Is it easy? Is it hard? And sometimes just the terminology may make it hard to figure out. If you change the titles from easy, normal, hard to, wuss, loser, and okay guy, then that changes how people feel about which difficulty level to pick. Anyway, so yeah, that was another lesson learned, and we kind of got rid of difficulty levels in future Bejeweled games just because they are bad. And the final thing that I think I would say went wrong with Bejeweled was that I had a big fondness for themes in games. There were a lot of games there that were very kind of basic and minimal as far as their UI went. I always thought that it was a good idea to have really colorful themes and characters in all these games. And so I tried my hardest to make sure that was the case for all of our titles, including Bejeweled. So Diamond Mine originally had a bit of a mining theme. So when you lost, it would say cave in, and theoretically the idea was that the cave you're in collapsed and so forth. The best I can say for this attempt at a theme is that most people didn't even notice it, and it completely went away by the time we got to Bejeweled 2, which is good, because instead of sort of spacey New Age backgrounds, we would have had a lot of caves, I guess. But I was still a strong believer that the games needed a strong, coherent theme, and that led to some issues later on down the road. Sometimes it was good. I think Bookworm, for example, worked well because it added a very fun, coherent theme to word games, which are often a little bit abstract. In other cases, it didn't work so well, where Peggle was originally going to be a Norse mythology-themed game called Thunderball, in which Thor led his pet goat on a journey to Asgard that somehow involved a lot of pegs and bouncing balls and stuff. The goat was kind of cute, though, so I'm kind of sad that we lost the goat. But ultimately for Peggle, at some point we basically said, this is kind of stupid. Why don't we just have some lobsters and unicorns? And obviously that worked out a little bit better. So that was Bejeweled. So I guess the question is what happened after we finished the game? And, well, what happened was we kind of forgot about it and moved on. It went up on Microsoft's Gaming Zone site. We got paid $1,500 a month, and we sort of moved on to a bunch of other games and didn't think about it too much until a couple months later, where it started to have a lot of users. At that time, it had 20,000, 30,000 user peaks, which was more than any other game on the Gaming Zone. And people were starting to say, this is kind of unusual. What's going on with this game? So, we started paying more attention to Bejeweled then. We went back and said, well, maybe we should do something more with it. This was exacerbated by the fact that around this time the advertising market was collapsing, and Microsoft, whose site was entirely dependent on advertising, was starting to get a little bit antsy about where they're getting money from. And so we're starting to kind of say, maybe that next game, maybe won't pay you $1,500 a month for that, maybe $1,000, maybe. So we were starting to think that we needed to reconsider our business model. And indeed, we did. We decided to do Bejeweled Deluxe, which was, I guess, it's hardly the first downloadable game, but it was definitely, I think, one of the first of the new breed of downloadable games that helped to spark the casual genre. Largely the idea for this came from Howard Tomlinson, who was an English mobile programmer who did Palm Pilot games and done a lot of shareware back in the day. And so when we were doing the game, the deluxe version, we were unsure of ourselves. Our thought was, why will people, buy this game? They can play it online for free. And he said, they will. And he said, how much can we sell it for? And I think I said $2.99. And John said $5.99. And Howard said $19.99. And we said, what? And he said, if you price it at $2.99, they'll think it's crap. If you price it at $19.99, they'll be sure it's good. So that turned out to be the right answer as it went on. So Bejeweled Deluxe we did as a downloadable game. As an anecdote about the development of it, it was also the first introduction of the Bejeweled guy, who has the voice that says excellent and so forth. In Bejeweled 1, that was me, with a lot of heavy processing. But it wasn't me for any of the other games. So I'm just clearing that up. It was voice actors with a lot about processing for Bejeweled 2, 3, Twist, etc., etc. The development time for the first Java Bejeweled was, I don't even know, it was less than a month. It wasn't very long. John, do you remember? It was about a month. Bejeweled Deluxe was around 3 months, I think, approximately. So we thought that was a lot of time back then. As it turned out, it got a little longer later on. Here's a nice little photo. The first Bejeweled Deluxe was actually 1.4 megabytes, which meant it was probably the last game that could be distributed on floppy disks. So these were some of the discs that we had made up as sort of promotional items to give to people at conferences. And I think one of those was, we gave that to, I think, Robert Coffey at Computer Gaming World. And he kind of laughed and then went back, and they ended up writing about it and giving it some sort of award that they made up. So that was kind of cool. The other story that I have to tell about the early days of Bejeweled Deluxe is the Kaching story, which some people may have heard. When we first started selling the downloadable game, Brian, our programmer, went and wrote a program so that every time someone actually purchased it, it would play a sound effect on one of our computers that would, a cash register sound of a Kaching. And so he put it there, and then the story that John has is he was talking to his aunt, your mom, I don't know, someone, and they're telling him, like, John, you can't make any money sitting on the couch. And from the other room came this ka-ching, ka-ching, and he said, yes, I can. So anyway, the ka-chings started coming fairly fast and furious, and so we were pretty sure that that downloadable model was going to work. We weren't totally sure why, but it was doing all right. So moving down the Bejeweled franchise line, we had Bejeweled 2, which came out, I think, in 2004. So, that obviously it allowed us the opportunity to fix a lot of the problems with the first Bejeweled, like the UI and so forth, and graphics that I didn't draw. And also add some of the things like power gems, which were a pretty big addition. We had a lot of other things that we tried for Bejeweled 2. We had a lot of kind of negative pieces. We had bombs and spiky things and boulders that you couldn't match. And the important lesson we learned from those was that they didn't make the game any more fun. They made it more complex, but nobody really liked them. So we decided that we wanted to avoid the fate of some titles like Tetris that create these variants that are different, but not actually better than the original. And so that's kind of been the bar we've tried to set for Bejeweled over the years, is that if we're going to add stuff to it, to make sure it's stuff that is universally improving the game that nobody ever wants to take out. If people had said after playing Bejeweled 2, can I play it in classic mode? I'd like to play it in Bejeweled 1 mode. I would have felt that was a big failure. I think there was one single person who did say that and said, I like the rules better in Bejeweled 1. But there's only one guy, and he was kind of stupid. So, the development time for Bejeweled 2, of course, was getting a little longer, and I think that was just about 2 years, which we felt was outrageously long at the time. Little did we know that later on that wouldn't seem so bad. Speaking of, later on we did Bejeweled Twist, which came out in 2007, I think. And that game was a learning experience for us in a couple ways. That took at least 3 years to do. And the lesson learned there is longer is not always better. And we tried some stuff with Bejeweled Twist that I wouldn't say it's a failure, but it definitely turned out to be mechanics that a lot of Bejeweled players did not particularly like. As a game by itself, I think it's a good one. As a Bejeweled game, it doesn't quite feel right. And so it's done all right, but it feels like it's a little bit out of step with what people are expecting from Bejeweled games. Yes, 3 years. A long 3 years. Then somewhere around that time we did our first, we'd had mobile versions of Bejeweled over the years, but most of them had been done by external parties like Electronic Arts or so on. So we did our first version of Bejeweled for the iPhone around 2008. And that turned out to work really well. We kind of knew that Bejeweled would work well on the iPhone because we'd had versions for Palm Pilots years ago. And so we kind of knew that touch mechanic was pretty good. And we felt that it would be a good match for the iPhone, and it's turned out to do very well. The really interesting thing we had about the development of Bejeweled for the iPhone was the fact that your finger is not a stylus. And in fact, people's fingers are comparatively big and clumsy. And this is a problem that plagues a lot of iPhone games, is that they try to port games that require a lot more precision than people's fingers are capable of. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on successful iPhone apps where they kind of minimize or get around that problem. For typing, for example, there's an awful lot of predictive stuff that Apple does to try and make sure that you press the right letter. And so for Bejeweled on the iPhone, we ended up with an equivalent, which we called fat finger detection, which meant that if you play Bejeweled on the iPhone and you try and make a swiping motion to swap a gem in an area, even if you kind of miss the actual match, we'll look at that area and say, okay, there's a match in the upper right quadrant. You swiped an area that doesn't actually have a match, but we think you probably meant to do this. And then we'll actually do the swap that we think you meant to do. You have to be pretty careful with that, because if you're too generous with it, you'll tap something in the bottom left, and then a match happens in the top right, and the game feels like it's playing itself. But most of the time, people don't notice it, because they go, oh yeah, of course I meant to do that. So it's one of those little things that actually makes a huge difference, and most people don't notice it unless you turn it off or take it out, at which point the game just suddenly starts feeling kind of clumsy and awkward. What am I doing for time? Okay. So here's a few stats on Bejeweled iPhone. It's sold a bunch, and later on, when we get to Bejeweled Blitz, you'll see that we have an interesting crossover with that. A lot of people play Bejeweled Blitz on their iPhone as well as on Facebook. So we felt that it's kind of unique in being one of the very few games that does have this ability to cross over from one platform to another. Something like more than half of the people who play Bejeweled Blitz on their iPhone also play it on Facebook. And that leads us to Bejeweled Blitz, which came out I think I said 2009, but it might have been late 2008. Now Bejeweled Blitz was a bit of a reaction to what had happened on Bejeweled Twist, in that I didn't want to do another 3-year Bejeweled title, so I wanted to do something fast. And at the same time, our business guy, Dennis, kept coming up to me and saying, those Facebook games, I hear they're pretty big. I hear Facebook games are going to be big. And initially, we sort of just kept blowing him off and saying, he's like, yeah, that's like zombies biting ninjas. That's all stupid. But eventually, I was thinking, okay, maybe he's right. Maybe there's something there. We should perhaps try and do something. We were hindered by a couple things. One of them was the fact that we didn't have a single Flash programmer in the entire company. So we had that required a bit of creative thought, and what we ended up with was we had one outsourced version of Bejeweled 2 in Flash that didn't really work, so we had never released it, and we had one customer support guy, Jason Payne, who had decided to learn Flash in his spare time. And so I said, well, okay, that's good enough. We'll get those two guys together, and we'll try and do something kind of quick and dirty for Facebook. So it took about 3 months to get that done, but it was pretty rough around the edges, but it kind of got the idea across. Later on, of course, we needed to recruit a little more heavily to fill up the necessary vacancies that we had, but that turned out. So we don't have that problem anymore. It's okay. So Bejeweled Blitz came out, and there's some more stats here. It's done quite well, and although we developed it quickly, that was a refreshing change from 3-year development cycles. But what we're now discovering, of course, is that with social games, that development cycle never actually ends. So people who are on Bejeweled Blitz, 2 years ago, can still be on Bejeweled Blitz, because it's a service. It's not a fire and forget product that you just release and forget about. It's something we had to keep adding to and evolving. And so that's been a different kind of development for us as well. So trying to transform Bejeweled from the kind of game it was in 2000 to the kind of game it has to be relevant in 2011 has been a bit of a real learning curve for us. And those are a bunch of stats. I don't know, there's a lot of stuff there. A lot of gems. I want some more gem stats, yeah. Then Bejeweled 3. Bejeweled 3 came out in 2010. That was kind of a parallel development with things like Bejeweled Blitz, and it was kind of in some ways maybe not the last gasp, but certainly one of the holdovers from our older way of doing games, where you had a fairly long development cycle and you had a single product rather than an ongoing service or set of products. So that took about 2 years. So we got better, but it's still a little long given the kind of world we're seeing now. But we're pretty happy with Bejeweled 3. We did feel like we didn't alter the mechanics dramatically, but we felt that we got back to the core of what people liked about Bejeweled that maybe we had drifted away from with Bejeweled Twist. And then finally, just I think a week or two ago, we released Bejeweled Blitz Live for Xbox Live, which was, again, kind of an experiment, bringing the Blitz mechanics to Xbox. where you don't have the Facebook social graph, but you have a different social graph, which is your Xbox Live friends. So it's a little bit early for us to tell whether that's going to be successful, but it lends itself to a different kind of social interaction. People on Xbox Live don't really play asynchronously. They play synchronously. They get together and they play at the same time, and the whole thing is set up so that people can play in the same room and talk to each other and all that, where Facebook is set up for asynchronous play, where you sort of play and other people play whenever it's convenient. What's next for Bejeweled? I guess I have a few more minutes. I'll try and finish up here and then leave a bit of time for questions. Well, I'm not sure exactly what I can say that's not secret, but I can promise you this. There's a popular game played at the PopCap offices called Bejeweled Blitz Carnage, which is a drinking game that anyone who goes to the local tavern, the Two Bells, is likely to spot happening. So you can see all us sitting there with iPhones playing Bejeweled Blitz. And I'm replicating here, for the benefit of anyone at GDC who might have an iPhone and Bejeweled, the rules, the official drinking game rules for Bejeweled Blitz Carnage. So everyone starts playing a game of Bejeweled Blitz on their iPhone at the same time. And at the end, whoever has the lowest score subtracts that from the person with the highest score and has to take a drink for every 10,000 point difference. So I think the record I've seen is there was a case where the high score was 400,000 and the low score was about 10,000. So that can add up to a lot. And in some cases, that also means that the loser will drop out of the game fairly quickly thereafter. So now that may seem like a joke, but it actually did lead to some interesting thoughts for the future of Bejeweled, in that I don't know about the drinking part necessarily for everybody, but it was interesting to be able to play that game in a group experience somewhere outside of your computer room at home. So being able to do that in a bar or in a restaurant starts leading to a lot of interesting ideas for things like geolocation and so on. So I think we might start seeing things like that. I think that no one has quite nailed geolocation games yet, but I have a feeling that it might be interesting to experiment with that with Bejeweled. And yes, now that I have a few seconds left, I will give away a secret. Bejeweled Blitz players may be familiar with the cat's eye gem that causes a cat head to fly out of the screen and shoot lasers to blow stuff up. So I'm going to reveal the actual identity of the laser cat. It's my cat. Her name is Snackers, and she has a secret cameo in every single Bejeweled game to date. So that's a secret nobody knows. And so in closing, I guess the final thought I have about being allowed to come up here and speak about Bejeweled as a classic game is that I do feel it's quite an honor that our game is even considered a classic alongside a lot of the ones that are in this list. At 10 years old, it's certainly the youngest of those games. So I kind of hope that in maybe another 10 or 20 years, they'll invite us back to give another postmortem of the next 20 years of Bejeweled. So the image that keeps coming to my head is at the end of Saving Private Ryan, where Matt Damon has been saved and everyone else is dead, and Tom Hanks, whispers in his ear, earn this, and then Matt Damon has to go on to, lead a good life to justify the sacrifice everyone made. So, yes, I'm hoping we'll earn the honor of being considered a classic game with what we do with Bejeweled in the future. So, that's it. Thanks. So I'm told there's a couple microphones back in the aisles here. So if people want to ask questions, I think we have a few minutes for that.
I have a question.
Okay. Who are you? Oh, there you go.
Hi.
Hi.
In the early versions of the game, how much of AI did you have to determine what gems would drop and make sure there were moves available for players? And how did that evolve over later editions?
The question was there any AI in the early versions of the game that sort of selected which gems fell in to make sure you still had valid moves? And the answer is none. In the earlier versions of the game, there was no AI of any sort to do that. And if you ran out of moves, you ran out of moves. It would just say, if it was the standard game, it would just say out of moves and your game ended. If it was a time game, it would say no more moves and all the gems would fall off and you get a new board that would drop in. That was a little bit inelegant, and so in later versions like Bejeweled 2 and later, there is AI that checks. In the untimed version, you still run out of moves. In the timed version, we figure you've got enough of a problem with whatever clock is counting down. So it makes sure that whenever new gems fall in, that there's at least one potential match available on the board after that. Some people believe that there's more sophisticated logic going on in terms of trying to set people up with certain kinds of moves or making it easier or harder, but there really isn't. It's pretty straightforward. Any other questions? Nope. Oh, wait, someone's moving up.
Well, I had a question about the sequels. Just with the first one, I mean, the basic concept of Bejeweled is relatively simple, so it didn't take very long. Why did the sequels take so much longer? You had 2-3 year development times.
Well, the question was, why did all those sequels take so long? Good question. Well, I mean, part of it became that as they became more complex in terms of some of the subtle things about them, it took a lot more time. Part of the thing that we try and do at PopCap is make sure that games are simple but fun. And as it turns out, sometimes simplicity takes longer than complexity. So some of those games you would have seen much more complex versions of them at 1 year in, and by the time 2 years rolled around, they're actually simpler. So the sad truth is that sometimes a lot of that time was spent doing things that didn't work out or that got tried and then removed. So it's sad because it's not evident, so you don't get to see the stuff that got taken out. But at the end, we feel that striving for simplicity is kind of the direction we want to go in as a company, and so we're willing to spend a bit more time to reach that.
Thank you.
Does that help? Oh no. Any more questions? Anyone else? Okay, you, yeah.
Yeah, what did you guys think of Puzzle Quest? Was that a surprise to you guys, or just a path you guys didn't want to go down?
The question is, what do we think of Puzzle Quest? I love Puzzle Quest. I think it's a great game. Yeah. We sometimes have, there's been some games that have come out there's been a number of clones and stuff of Bejeweled. I'm not really fond of the ones that don't add anything or that are just or that are worse than the original game. But a game like Puzzle Quest I thought was great because it added something that we honestly would never have come up with ourselves. So it really was super cool. So yeah, we're big fans. All right, this guy.
Yeah, I've been playing Bejeweled Twist quite a while, quite a lot, and I'm wondering why it's not possible to move in both directions, twist the gem in both directions.
The question was, in Bejeweled Blitz, why you're not allowed, or rather Bejeweled Twist, why you're not allowed to rotate the gems in the counterclockwise direction. And
because it will make much more sense, I think.
Well, and the answer is, you're fired. That's the answer.
But John Veach is gonna give me $100 for this.
Yes.
So
yeah. That was actually the backstory on that was that was the first question that everyone asked about Bejeweled Twist is why you couldn't rotate the gems in both directions, and it was the first thing we actually tried, and it actually made the game much worse, in that it created a much larger possibility space of moves, and most people would just stare paralyzed at the screen trying to figure out what to do next. So, but it didn't keep people from asking that question regularly every week or so, and so I started threatening to fire anyone who ever asked that question again. So. He's fired now. Okay. Next.
In terms of the casual audience, have you noticed your players becoming more sophisticated over the years, and how sophisticated do you think the audience can take, like in terms of gameplay today?
Was a question there about have I noticed a difference between the casual audience and the hardcore audience?
No, just over the years, have you noticed your player base kind of training up with taking more and more complex game types, or do you think the audience, like from 10 or 5 even, is kind of the same as today?
Okay. The question was whether the audience for casual games has gotten more sophisticated over the years. That's an odd question. I'd say yes and no. I would say that on the one hand, clearly they have, in that some of our games in the last couple of years, like Plants vs. Zombies in particular, are quite sophisticated by comparison to our earlier titles, and the audience seems to be okay with that. At the same time, I would say that in some ways, some of the audience has gotten less sophisticated. You've got people on iPhone and Facebook now who are very, very casual gamers, even by our standards, and they don't. For them, they want games that are even simpler than the ones we were doing 10 years ago because they're either very unfamiliar with games or they're playing on a bus with one hand or something like that. And so oddly, in those cases, we're actually thinking about games that have to be made even simpler. If you look at something like Angry Birds, that's quite a simple game, and I think that's to its benefit. I don't think making that game more complex would have made it more popular. So I'd say that we seem to be going in two directions. You've got a trend towards more sophisticated titles. At the same time, you have these brand new, relatively naive, people who are starting to play games who've never played any sort of game before, and they are kind of looking for very simple games. So yeah, I don't think it's a simple answer one way or the other.
Hi. Considering your development time, how big were your teams, and what's the composition of the team? And also the second question is, how much time did you guys spend on level designs, or if any?
How much time do we spend on level designs?
Yes.
And
also, how big the team, considering the long development time?
I'm not sure I got the question. Was it for
how big was your team when you developed the game, and also how much time you spent doing the level design, or was it randomized?
I can answer how much time we spend on level design, which is very, very, very little, because there's not really a lot of levels in any of the Bejeweled games. We spent some time on puzzle design in some of the games like Bejeweled 2. In terms of the overall size of the teams, that hasn't changed too much over the years. Obviously, the first game was 2 or 3 people. And to be honest, most of the later games have been only slightly larger. They've been maybe 4 or 5 people. And then occasionally a larger team might show up in the last stages of the game to do quality assurance and marketing and things like that. But the bulk of the games are still done by teams of less than 6 people. So they may take a long time, but in terms of man years or whatever, they're still fairly small scale compared to, an Assassin's Creed or a typical console title. All right. I think that's about it. I think I'm getting the peace sign or something. I don't know. So yeah, if there's any more questions, nope. Okay. Well, thank you.